Hello and welcome back, HeirofCarthage here, and today, yes, I've got another State of the Faction for you. We got to cover yesterday Chaos, and boy were they lacking. And today, we're going to be covering another Game 1 faction that is actually very chaosy in nature as well, and it is the Beastmen, folks. That's right, back in July of 2016, we were introduced to the trailer that you see playing in the background. It was the call of the Beastmen. And you know what? As far as things I was interested in, at this point I was still new to the Warhammer franchise. I really knew most of my fantasy stuff from Lord of the Rings, and the Beastmen weren't quite like anything I knew from that. And I was kind of wondering, like, is this going to be fun? And all of a sudden, here came that lovable scamp Gorbel, and he trampled his way straight into my heart. And ever since then, I have really enjoyed playing the Beastmen. Even though I don't normally get into the quote-unquote evil or chaos factions, the Beastmen just had that very aggressive playstyle. They were enjoyable in multiplayer, and then of course I had a good time making jokes about Al Gorbel being the only person that could possibly save humankind by first destroying them. And remember, folks, as always, vote Gorbel in 2024. Now, so as far as the Beastmen go, like I said, they were added in July of 2016. They were a lot of fun. They fit in pretty decent in Game 1. However, fast forward into the future, and eventually here comes Game number 2. And much like our Chaos friends yesterday, the Beastmen found themselves, well, left behind. But fortunately for us, unlike the Chaos, so 5 years later in July of 2021, we saw this trailer, which was the Silence and Fury DLC, and alongside of it came a rework of the Beastmen for all who owned the Call of the Beastmen DLC. Plus, we got the additional Legendary Lord Tarox. This additional content and rework brought changes to the way that Beastmen campaign worked. It updated their campaign starts, it added new units to the roster, and it breathed some much needed life into a faction that was essentially dead in Game 2. I mean, almost no one was playing Beastmen campaigns because they were boring. And, well, the new mechanics changed a lot. They added a lot, and I even got to play some campaigns on camera, and they were a lot of fun. So, CA made the updates. Does this faction then fare better than our Chaos friends did yesterday? I think you all know the answer to that, but hey, let's jump into it, and let's take a look at the state of the faction in Warhammer for the Beastmen prior to going into Game 3. So we're a little less than 2 months away. Are the Beastmen ready for Game 3? Let's go check it out. All right, as per standard business, let's jump right into the campaign starts and mechanics and buffs, just everything else that we, generally speaking, talk about when we're hitting one of these State of the Faction videos. And the Beastmen have 4 starts in Mortal Empires. This is going to be Khazrak, you're going to have Malagor, you're going to have Morgur, and you're going to have Tarox. Now, this is an interesting State of the Faction, as will have kind of been mentioned in the introduction. The Beastmen went for 5 years, basically from July of 2016 all the way up until July of 2021, with very few changes other than, I believe we had Morgur added in, I think, when the Wood Elves DLC came out or something like that. I don't remember the exact timing, but not much had changed with the Beastmen. Their roster remained mostly untouched, their campaigns mostly untouched. I think maybe they just added like a start position or something. And it's possible that even that came later. I didn't go back and double check every last thing. I know some of their start positions changed over time, so I don't have all the history on the start positions. But let's take a look at those now. As far as start positions goes, Khazrak starts in Astalia, which is really fun because not much else starts in that region other than, I guess, if you pick the Fae, and she's a little bit north of there. And then, of course, the Skaven have Ikit Claws start not far from there in Skaven Blight. So it is a fun start position, as Astalia is probably an underseen area, unfortunately, on the Warhammer map, and it's quite a bit of fun. Now, RNS Assault Spite also starts not far from there, so basically the action comes hot and hard for Khazrak. You've got Bretonnia knocking on your door immediately. You've got Astalia and Tylea there immediately. You've got the Skaven. So it is a fun start for Kazarak with plenty of action. And then let's take a look at Malagor. His start is actually in the Badlands. And we all know from the Greenskins state of the faction that the Badlands are absolutely crawling with Greenskins. And you are going to get your money's worth in the start position. The Beastmen are an interesting match in terms of the way they fight. And again, we're not going to get into roster specifics here, but being matched up against that many Greenskins, both factions that are quite capable of doing a lot of damage against low armor, you're definitely in for some epic brawls early on with Malagor. And of course, he is much more magic focused than he is melee focused. And so, but he does have some good starting units here, like this Giant and the Manticore, which can cause terror. Now, the Warherd of the Shadowgave starts in Nordland, so this is a more Empire-centric start, with also the ability to go face off against Norska. And then with the most recent changes, there's actually some Wood Elves fairly nearby as well. So you get a little bit of a smorgasbord starting as Morgr. Finally, added with the Silence and the Fury DLC, we got Taurox. And Taurox gets a Nagaron start in the Mortal Empires campaign map, which is a lot of fun as you're going to be up against the Druchii early on, and they make for quite a powerful foe and will keep you on your toes. They have a lot of AP missiles and other stuff, so very good. Let's take a look at some of these. Well, first let's talk about the general race attributes, and then we'll talk about the different warherds or factions and what their benefits are. So as race attributes, CA and the Silence and the Fury also released a free update, quote unquote free, right? Because you had to own the Beastmen, the Call of the Beastmen DLC to begin with. But if you own the Call of the Beastmen DLC, it came with a Beastmen rework that was badly needed. Like I said, this was 5 years in the waiting for Beastmen players. It added Herd Stones and Blood Grounds, which we'll take a quick look at here soon. It added Dread, which is a really cool faction currency, and then basically changed their roster a little bit, made a couple of key additions. So as far as race attributes go, the Beastmen got a huge boost, and we'll take a look at those on the campaign map here shortly. And as far as specific buffs for each one, Kazarak, you can see here, is focused on ambush chance and evading when using the underway. He gets specific buffs to Razorgore chariots, and Vanguard deployment for Bestigors, poison attacks for all Ungor units. So you can see that's the focus of his faction. Whereas with Malagor, he gets some campaign movement range buffs, a little bit of buff for Bray Shamans, and then he gets buffs when using the Beast Paths. Enemy leadership drops for all local armies, and their casualty replenishment rate drops because he is the Harbinger of Disaster. He gets fear out of Harpy units as well. Morgr, his focus is going to be on faster replenishment. He gets extra capacity for Chaos Spawn. Chaos Spawn can make very nice early game units. He spreads Chaos Corruption, and his Horde building construction cost is a little cheaper. Well, that's a huge deal, but it is what it is. Got the Despoiler rating stance, which spreads corruption and attrition. He's got a passive ability, which is the Aura of Vile Transmutation, magic resistance for his army, and then he's immune to attrition from the forest, essentially, when he's in Athaloran, because Morgr has a specific beef against the pointy ears. And then it says Morgr will always remain wounded for no more than 1 turn. So he comes back very, very quickly. And then as far as Taurox goes, he has a rampage mechanic, which is unique to him. And it's quite fun, that can allow him to just continue attacking and attacking if you play it right. Minotaurs are cheaper for increasing their capacity through Dread. And then Taurox has this River of Blood. After winning battles, stacks up to 3 armies. And then you get weapon strength buff for Minotaurs and the ability Blood Beast. So Taurox is definitely a very different feel than the others. Anyway, that's the kind of the different, what do you call it, faction and lord mechanics that come with the Beastmen. It's really pretty good. And like I said, we'll take a look at them, an example here in a moment of the Herd Stones and Dread. But before we do that, let's head over to the Eye of the Vortex and check out for Beastmen. And they do have a start, and this is Taurox, so this is good. They do have a place in the Vortex campaign, so at least at current in Warhammer 2, and I don't think the Vortex campaign is going to make it into Game 3, right? But I'm just using this as an example. Did the Beastmen finally get a place in all facets of the Warhammer 2 narrative? And in this case, yes, with Taurox giving us that start. All right, let's go load in and take a look at those in-map mechanics in the campaign. Now, I used Taurox for the example here. The factions are all fairly similar, except for this Rampage panel, which is unique to Taurox. So, in terms of what you're going to see with the Beastmen when you load up, they added this Marks of Ruination, which is really important because when the Beastmen got their rework, instead of just being another bland nomadic faction that was exactly like we saw Chaos in, the Beastmen now recruit differently. When it comes to recruitment, you're not paying to upkeep armies, you're not paying to recruit units. And so it means that your interaction with money, quote unquote, in the campaign, which is actually favor from the Dark Gods, but it's very different than other factions, giving the Beastmen a very unique feel in that sense, other than the Tomb Kings have something slightly similar. But the Beastmen recruit units based on unit caps, and basically they can recruit whatever they want, as much as they want, as long as it's unlocked in terms of unit caps. And those unit caps are dictated by first unlocking the building that gives you access to those units. So like, for instance, building up these horde buildings. Let's show you that horde building panel here. So when you pick the right buildings, it can unlock the recruitment of certain units. And then once you've unlocked that recruitment, you have to look at this dread screen as well, which is rewards of dread. And this tells you the number of these units that you can recruit. And this is a global number, right? So no matter how many armies you have, what you can recruit is determined globally. And some of it is locked and requires you to have more Marks of Ruination first. So basically what it does is it steps you out your ability to build armies based on your progress in the campaign, so that you can't just cheese a whole bunch of elite units. And the fact that there's caps on units actually does kind of force the player to, again, not just elite unit doom stack with the Beastmen. You actually have to earn your way if you want to be fielding those doom stacks. It takes quite a bit of time because you have to earn enough dread. Dread is earned through winning battles and raising settlements and all that kind of stuff. So it does take time. You can spend that dread that you earn, and see that right here. I have none at the moment, but you can spend it increasing unit caps. You can spend it unlocking more legendary lords. You can spend it to unlock more hero units. You can spend it to get upgrades to your the blood, the blood ground settlements that you leave out there. And you can spend it to upgrade the level at which new lords are recruited, army capacity. So if you need more armies, you spend your dread. So it's a really cool thing. Basically, your aggression fuels your dread. The dread fuels your ability to have better armies. And then on top of that, when you do earn favor or standard currency from raising settlements, sacking settlements, raiding, all that kind of stuff, you can then spend it on this item sheet over here, which has access to some fun and unique items that you can use in your campaign. So a very cool system. It's a system that rewards a Beastman player for aggressive play and makes it so much better than just being the standard copy-paste nomadic faction where you just raise the map until the map is empty. And that's aided by the Blood Ground ability. And let's demonstrate the Blood Grounds here just real quick. I'll go up here and auto-resolve a battle. So here I'm going to auto-resolve. And once you do this, if you have a shard, which you do start with one, we can raise a herd stone. And although Beastmen don't settle, the same that other factions do, you're still building a horde encampment, right? But you get these blood grounds where you've raised a totem, basically, and this becomes your hunting ground. And it incentivizes the player to go out and attack these settlements. You can see here the blood ground, and it tells you how much each settlement in this blood ground is worth. And once you win those, and then you can do a ritual here that converts that into the Marks of Ruination, which then allows you to unlock different types of units and more units and all kinds of stuff like that. So again, it basically encourages the player to be aggressive and play and take out all these regions. And then the AI can't resettle any of these areas within the blood ground unless they come tear down your totem that you've made. In this case, it's Storag Core. So a very interesting ability. It makes the Beastmen not feel just like a plain nomadic faction, but at the same time, they're not settling down and having to manage some big empire. Anyway, I feel like these are really neat mechanics that CA added. I got to play an entire Beastmen campaign. It's up on my channel if you want to go check it out. I did an entire campaign with Tarox in, I believe it was Mortal Empires. It could have been the Vortex. I don't recall which one I did with which, but in any case, it's very fun. I enjoyed it, and it's the first time I really thoroughly enjoyed a Beastmen campaign, which is sad because it was the same way with Chaos, right? We kind of enjoyed the Chaos campaign just because of mods and stuff, but now you can actually thoroughly enjoy a Beastmen campaign. So in terms of campaign mechanics and starts and stuff, the Beastmen for a Game 1 faction are in excellent shape. And over a year ago, that would not have been the case. So this wasn't until July of 2021 that CA finally sorted this. It was long awaited, but it was good. It was very good changes. Now, did CA also get a good look at the roster for the Beastmen and how do they perform in battle? So let's go take a look at it. All right, here in the custom battle screen, we've got the Beastmen pulled up, and let's start to break apart this roster. As is standard, I'm going to jump down to just infantry, and we'll work our way back up and take a look at the heroes and lords. Now, the Beastmen roster was one of the thinnest rosters in the game until July of 2021 when we got the Silence and the Fury DLC. It was badly needed to get something done to the Beastmen roster. They had some severe holes in their rosters. Now, they could be used, and they were a fun faction to use, but they were difficult. And it was because they were lacking some key tools. Now let's go through what they have. And remember, this is the state of the faction right now in early 2022, not in 2020 when they were still in limbo. So let's take a look at the state of their faction right now. Looking at the infantry, the Beastmen infantry, in some of these episodes I've been covering units in more detail. Sometimes I may choose to do that, sometimes I may not. That's not really per se the focus of this, to hit every unit in detail. Sometimes I may just summarize. In any case, just making that known there for people as they come through and watch these. Now, the Beastmen infantry line, for the most part, is low armor and pretty hard hitting, and has decent variety to it. But its struggle is that the more elite stuff, which is Bestigors, is pretty expensive and usually came in small numbers. This means that players, whenever they were facing off against enemies previously, both in multiplayer and in campaign, had to struggle sometimes with infantry that was a little bit squishy in the wrong matchups, and so it could get fairly difficult. But let's take a look at that. They do have anti-large with Ungor Spearmen, and then Ungor Spearherd with shields. This provides a little bit of anti-large capability. Neither one is particularly strong, but sometimes it's good to just have that ability. I'll pull them up so you can see their stats there. And then in terms of cheap infantry, you got Ungor Herd, Gore Herds with shields, and then Gore Herds. And essentially, the Ungor Herd is the cheaper version. Not great, but, they can get around the battlefield relatively quick. A lot of Beastmen infantry have the Vanguard deployment, which is one of their benefits. They can basically attack from all kinds of different vantage points on the battlefield. Not every unit, though, is Vanguard deploy. Like, if you look up here, like Bestigors, for instance, do not get this. So anyway, Gore Herds are essentially a better version of what you get in the Ungor Herd, and then the Gore Herd without the shield is the best attack that you're going to get out of these standard low armor units, but it's going to sacrifice some melee defense. Not that any of the Beastmen units have a particular load of melee defense to begin with. And then ultimately at the top of the stack, you get Bestigor Herd, which is honestly a pretty decent elite infantry. It's not going to be the best in the game. It's certainly not the worst in the game, but the Bestigor Herd gives you a nice AP anti-infantry tool that is tough and can hang in there with most things in the game. So as far as infantry goes, typical rule is quick, hard-hitting, and squishy. Like, that's going to be the typical rule for Beastmen infantry. You kind of want to rely on some hit-and-run tactics to be able to win decisively and quickly, because you really don't want to get in a long, drawn-out fight with the Beastmen infantry. That's not where they belong. In terms of missile infantry, it's always been thin, and it's because the Beastmen just don't play a lot of missile infantry. That said, don't go ahead and write out Ungor Raiders. These may be short-range missiles and fairly weak, but they do play an important role in the Beastmen army. And even if it's just to keep enemy skirmishers honest when you have a couple of these units, meaning that those enemy skirmishers can't just solely focus on other units, they have to respect the fact that you have these Ungor Raiders. Their range is short, but they also have stalk and Vanguard deploy. So a lot of times they can cover the distance to the longer ranged enemy missiles with that stalk. So it gives them some interesting capability. Now, in terms of cavalry, this is one of my favorite areas for the Beastmen. The Beastmen have excellent light cavalry. Centaurs hit very hard for a light cavalry and are at a pretty reasonable price. They may not be quite as good as something like Wild Riders, but they're solid, and they are going to clean up skirmishers and stuff very well, and they will also do a lot of damage to light unarmored infantry. And there's also chariots. Tuskor chariots are a cheaper version of these chariots, and these were utterly broken at the release of the DLC. I think they might have finally fixed them. But they are excellent at taking out infantry at a low cost, and definitely a very solid tool for any Beastmen army. And then above them, you've got Centaurs with great weapons, which is a big brother version of the Centaurs. Centaurs with great weapons may be squishy, not have a lot of armor, but if these guys charge into a fight against other heavy cavalry or monsters and they don't get countercharged, they can cause tremendous damage, especially when they're coupled up with something like Chaos Warhounds with poison, which will slow down and take away damage from the enemy unit. So Centaurs with great weapons are an excellent tool for cutting down armor and large targets. Again, you just have to be careful. They don't usually want to go head-to-head in a charge, but if they can get in there afterwards, they can be very effective. You got Razor Gore chariots, which are a heavier hitting version of the Tuskor chariots that have more armor and are more survivable and cause a little more damage. And as far as the rest of missile and missile cavalry, they do also have a Centaur unit that has throwing axes. These are relatively short range, but do cause AP damage. And in the right scenarios, they can be very, very handy. So you wouldn't want to ignore these units. Although it's not a long range capability, they can be irritating against the right factions and be useful. Now, Monsters and Beast. The Beastmen had a lot of options here, and they got even more options as of the Silence and the Fury, and they definitely needed some of those options here. So let's run through these. The Chaos Warhounds and Warhounds with Poison, very critical to help supporting the Centaur forces. Very nice units to have on the roster. Razor Gore Herd provides a nice AP punch that you can put behind cheaper infantry like Ungor Herds and Gore Herds. They're a nice 1-2 punch, kind of like Orc Boys and Squigs. You put the two together, and the infantry unit covers some of the hit point sponging, while the unit of Razor Gores, or Squigs in the case of the Greenskin, does the AP damage. They act kind of like chariots. They're like a monstrous cavalry unit, a feral monstrous cavalry. They go berserk easy, and they can die easy, but they can also cause a lot of damage in the right situation. Harpies are kind of like a flying light cavalry, and they're very good at that in the sense that they can get in and disrupt enemy formations. They can ruin enemy cavalry charges. They can rear attack enemy infantry. They're going to be quite weak in melee on their own, but they are really there for disruption and outflanking penalty. And in that regard, they're quite handy for the Beastmen. The Feral Manticore gives the Beastmen another flying option, and the Feral Manticore is the same as what we saw with Chaos. Really like this unit. It's low armor, and you do have to worry about the rampage, but it causes a lot of damage. It also has terror, meaning that this gives the Beastmen a cheap option to be able, remember how I said that their tactics rely a lot on local advantage, let's call it that. Meaning you ambush, you hit one local section of an enemy army, you overwhelm it and rout it quickly, and you don't want to stay in that fight for a long time. Well, the Manticore is a great tool for that because of that terror ability, and it helps support Beastmen type tactics. So I really like the Manticore in that roster. You got a Chaos Spawn. Chaos Spawn we've seen before, high damage, low armor. I mean, it is what it is. They combine with cheap infantry units, right? They're not a standalone unit. Then we get into the good stuff here. Minotaurs, there's 3 variants. You got standard Minotaurs, which have a shield. You've got that do not have a shield. Standard Minotaurs. You got the Minotaurs with shields. You got the Minotaurs with great weapons. Now, the standard Minotaurs are going to be an anti-infantry variant, and they do AP damage, and they get a specific anti-infantry bonus. Minotaurs with shields are kind of a halfway ground between the first one we just described and the Minotaurs with great weapons. These ones have a shield. They're going to be more resistant to missile fire, They're not specifically anti-infantry bonus, but they're still good against infantry with AP damage, and they would be decent against large because they also still maintain that AP damage, but they have a little more melee defense, making them a little more survivable in a long fight. Minotaurs with great weapons, however, are going to give you the biggest punch. They don't have as much melee defense, but they pack a wallop in AP and anti-large damage. But again, without that shield, they're more vulnerable to missiles, but they are specifically quite good at clearing out large targets and play a role very nicely. You still got a giant here for the Beastmen. The giant we've seen before, big damage, good against lords and other single targets, also decent in a melee blob that isn't spears or halberds. And then we got the Jabberslythe. The Jabberslythe was an incredibly interesting addition to the Beastmen roster and a very important one. Jabberslythe not only causes fear and terror, it's got this special ability that's kind of like a Mortis engine when it gets into combat. And on top of that, it's got AP damage and anti-infantry damage with magic and poison attacks. So the Jabberslythe can help cut through physical resistance. It can help slow down the damage at which enemy infantry is coming at you. It's very good at blobbing the enemy and then hurting their blob very badly. It's good at helping to deal with more elite infantry that has more armor. And it's also really good at just hurting cheaper infantry that would normally have stood their ground okay against the Beastmen possibly, but now they're getting terror routed with the Jabberslythe involved. It's a very great support opportunity for the Beastmen to have, and I think the Jabberslythe was a very important add for the Beastmen, and they needed it very much. And speaking of something they needed, the Gorgon. Yes, the Beastmen had Minotaurs with great weapons, which are pretty good AP anti-large, but when it came to these big knockout fights of large SEMs like dragons, the Beastmen were particularly vulnerable. That type of stuff. You could get in and chain route them, and there wasn't much they could do about it. Well, the Gorgon changed that. The Gorgon is a massively powerful, anti-large, single-entity monster killer. And it is a very powerful unit that the Beastmen were in dire need of, and it really helped fill a role in their roster. So it was an excellent addition by Creative Assembly, and in my opinion, filled up a gaping hole in the Beastmen roster. And then finally, we got the Cygor, which is an artillery / single entity monster unit. It's really good against infantry or blobs of infantry. Can still hit heavy cavalry too, assuming it's grouped together nicely. Does nice armor piercing damage and has really good range, but also doubles in melee as a pretty powerful monster. Not quite as good as a giant, but most of the way there, and pretty powerful. So it's an interesting combo artillery / single entity monster melee unit that the Beastmen get. Now, their roster may still seem small, because we've already covered it, but the Beastmen roster is now quite sound. It does what it's supposed to do, and it does it nicely. They move quick, they hit hard, they can ambush, they come at you with a beastly ferocity that you expect from a faction that bears that name, right? A faction called Beastmen, you expect them to come and hit hard and fast, and that's what they do. So that's their roster. Now let's talk about heroes and lords and how they fit in. As far as heroes, we got a new one in the Silence and Fury DLC, which this is the Warger hero. And this Warger is basically an additional melee hero outside of the Gorbol is the only hero we had previously. Or sorry, I think we had Bray Shamans. We had Bray Shamans and Gorbol. But we didn't have another melee hero. And the Warger gives a specific anti-infantry hero that can also, I believe, mount on the chariots. Which again, in multiplayer at least, and in campaign, gives you nice abilities for taking out infantry blobs, and especially elite infantry blobs. So the Warger is a very nice touch. And then you have all your Bray Shaman. As far as the lores of magic go, you've got Beast, Death, Shadows, and Wild. Now, Wild, of course, is a lore of magic specific to the Beastmen. It's also carried by Malagor, and it's quite fun. All of these Bray Shamans can be mounted on the same chariot mounts that the Warger can be, so they also kind of double as anti-infantry tools on the battlefield, and that's very good for them. It's a very nice role to have, because remember, Beastmen infantry can get a little bit squishy against more elite enemy infantry, so they're very valuable. As far as the lores of magic go, this is some pretty good magic lores. Beast is very useful, Death is very useful, Shadows is very useful, and honestly, Wild is not bad either. Like, not a ton of people use Wild. Well, actually, I say that. They kind of do, and they mostly like it for the Cygor summon. So all of the magic lures that you get for these Brave Shamans are all useful and all very relevant for the style of play that the Beastmen have. And then finally you get Gorbel, who is a specific AP anti-large hero. He's been around since the beginning for the Beastmen. He's very good. At one point he was probably straight broken when he had healing potions like everything did, but not anymore. Gorbel is in a pretty good spot, pretty expensive, but also capable of dishing out a lot of damage. So all in all, Gorbel is a nice support unit if you think you're going to have to take on more large units. Now let's look at lords. As far as generic lords go, you got a Beast Lord, which is like Dollar Store Kazrak. You can mount him on chariots. Again, just a melee-focused lord, very similar to Kazrak. And then you've got your Great Brave Shamans, which were added in the recent updates as well. These are very nice to have because you can choose to bring your Shaman as the Lord rather than just a hero. And you can also double. You could have a Brave Shaman Lord and hero, doubling different Lords of Magic or just focusing heavily on one. So take that either way you want, and they're similar to the way they are in their hero stance in that they have the chariot mounts. They can be pretty good at controlling enemy infantry. That's your generic Lords. So let's talk through the legendary, there's also the Doom Bull generic Lord. This one is Dollar Store Tarox. So there are 3 generic types of Lord. You've got Kazrak generic, Caster generic, and then you've got Tarox generic. So that's your 3 generic type Lords. And the Doom Bull, of course, is a much harder hitting, very specific version of a melee Lord. You know, it's different from Kazrak with that AP damage, and the fact that it's a large target and not just a normal entity size, more like an infantry size. All right, Kazrak, what's he good for? He's good as an anti-infantry tool. He can Vanguard deploy with his army, so he's great for ambush armies. And he has pretty darn solid melee stats if he's on foot. He's a pretty decent duelist. I mean, as good as it's going to get for the Beastmen. He's not like Sigvald or something, but he's pretty good. You put him on a chariot, and he is a devastating anti-infantry tool as long as he can steer clear of specific anti-large units. Morgur is a nice hit point pit. He heals, and he does pretty decent melee damage, right? He's kind of a hybrid. He's very weak in terms of armor, but the damage he dishes out is really pretty decent for he's not a caster. Kind of feels like one sometimes. And the reason he feels like one is because he has a couple of abilities that can summon Chaos Spawn. So Morgur is the Lord that you pick if you need to extend a fight out. You need decent melee capability, and you want your Lord to kind of be a tempting target, per se, for the enemy. But when that happens, he starts healing, the spawn summons come in, and it starts to drag that fight out, right? So that's where Morgur comes into play. And he's a pretty good pick as well. And then you got Tarox, the Brass Bull. Tarox is who you pick when you're feeling max rage and you just want max melee. You charge straight at the enemy, horns first, and you beat the crap out of him. That's how he works. His special abilities are all focused on melee, and he is very powerful in melee. You can see his armor piercing capability here. Massive AP damage, really good charge bonus, solid melee attack, decent defense, very high armor. And Tarox goes, his Slaughter Call ability here makes him even stronger. And then the Blood Beast is like this explosion he can use to blast his way out of infantry blobs. And then this Brass Body makes him much more survivable for about 40 seconds as well. So if you're feeling melee-centric, then Tarox is a pretty solid pick. Finally, Malagor, who now flies, now with 100% more flying. Previous. So he's no longer like Sartorial and relegated to the ground. He flies, and he's quick. He's a very fast unit. So basically this turns Malagor, it keeps his old role as the caster and basically like summoning Cygors and stuff. He can still do all that, because that was typically the only reason why people wanted to pick Malagor, is they would summon a bunch of Cygors and have one in their army as well, and then they'd end up with like 3 or 4 Cygors on the battlefield. That can still be done, but now Malagor can move around the battlefield quickly. His weapon strength is actually really good for a caster, and his melee attack is not bad. He's just very squishy in terms of armor. So if he gets into the right situation, he can hold his own in a melee, but if he gets into the wrong situation, he gets squished like a bug. And quite honestly, he kind of looks like one flying all around the battlefield, so it's fairly fitting. But I like the place where it leaves Malagor because he's now very unique. He's not just some, slightly different generic wild caster, right? He flies around and he acts totally different. So I really like the place that they have Malachor in. Anyway, that's the Beastmen roster. As far as I'm concerned, the Beastmen are going to be pretty competitive in multiplayer, and their armies are quite good in campaign, especially with all the changes that came in, the unit upgrades, the dread rewards, and all that kind of stuff that you can get. I feel like the Beastmen roster is totally up to snuff. May still be missing a few things from what people have seen in the past on tabletop, but it is in good shape. The Beastmen roster is fun to play, their campaign starts are fun to play, their mechanics are enjoyable, and overall, the Beastmen are in a great position. CA reworked these guys late in the game. They were in terrible shape. Terrible shape. Probably as bad or worse than what we saw with the Chaos Warriors yesterday. But now that's not the case. I feel like Beastmen are totally ready for Game 3, and they're going to be fun to play in Game 3. And, you know, like most of the factions, for all we know, we very well could see stuff added to them in Game 3. And although I don't think they're in desperate need of a bunch of additions, I do think there's probably some things from the old tabletop days that could be added to the Beastmen. It would be quite fun. It wouldn't break their roster, but it would just make it even more enjoyable. So I find the Beastmen to be in an excellent place. And as far as the state of their faction goes, it's definitely a thumbs up from me. These guys are ready for Game 3. So I guess they got a leg up on Archaon in that respect, right? Because he's totally not ready for Game 3, and we all have no idea what's going to happen with them. But there you go. Yesterday was a bit of a downer in terms of seeing where Chaos was at. I guess today is like that success story, right? Maybe this is where we'll see Chaos eventually. They were in the dumps, and now they're in good shape. I certainly hope that's the case, and I certainly think that CA will at some point make that happen. I think it's just a matter of time, and it takes time, because as they develop these, they seem to be doing a good job of taking their time and digging in and making something worth it. Anyway, HeirofCarthage signing out for now. As per usual, get down in those comments. Tell me what you think. Did I get it wrong? Was I missing things? Do you agree? Get down there and leave your comments so I can see what you think. HeirofCarthage signing out from this state of the faction. Hey, guess what's next, folks? Little hint, 20 years. 20 years, no, I'm just kidding. It's not the 20 years. It's the peasants. Keep your eyes out. Next state of the faction coming up soon. Get your pox arrows ready.